Welcome to my lecture, Coastal Management, Stakeholder Involvement. My name is Johanna Schumacher and I'm a scientist at the Leibniz-Institute for Baltic Sea Research and also at Klaipeda University in Lithuania. In this lecture, I will start with a brief overview about stakeholder involvement. Then I will show you some practical examples, which I will use to highlight benefits but also challenges of stakeholder involvement. I will introduce you to stakeholder mapping and different levels of involvement. And finally, I will end with the summary. Stakeholder involvement is a process in which the concerns, needs, and values of stakeholders are incorporated into decision-making. And hereby, a stakeholder can be defined as any individual, group, or organization that is affected by, involved, or interested in an issue. And stakeholder involvement is not only done because it has some benefits, but it is actually legally required for all plans or projects that have impacts on the environment. And most importantly for our course, stakeholder involvement is a core principle of the systems approach and integrated coastal zone management. But even though participation is already commonly applied in Baltic ICZM case studies, the implementation varies strongly between case studies. And this is what I would like to show you based on two practical examples. Before I come to the first example, I would like to show you where and how stakeholder involvement is conducted in a typical planning procedure. So here you see a simplified sketch, and the process usually starts with the project plan. This is submitted by the project developer to the approval authority, which then screens the documents and assesses the legal requirements. For example, if an environmental impact assessment is required. If this is the case, the next step is the scoping. And hereby, the scope, the elements, and the level of detail for the environmental impact assessment are defined. Once the environmental impact assessment report is completed by the project developer, it is checked for completeness and plausibility by the approval authority. And afterwards, it is publicly announced and displayed to the public. So at this stage, stakeholders are asked to provide statements, and also the general public can provide objections and comments on the documents. These are then transferred back to the project developer and they are discussed in a joint meeting with all affected parties. Afterwards, the comments are taken into account and the approval authority decides whether there's a need for additional measures or changes. And finally, when these are incorporated in the documents, it takes the decision whether the plans can be approved or not. But still, in the end, it is possible to take legal actions against these. So what we can see in this sketch is that the involvement of stakeholders takes place only late within the planning process. And the effects of this can be seen in my first case study. The case study is the coastal realignment and moor restoration case of Markgrafenheide and Hüttelmoor. In this case study, a new coastal protection scheme was needed for the village of Markgrafenheide. And the responsible authority decided to build a complex ring dike structure around the settlement area. And because of this, the former protection scheme in front of the nature reserve, which you can see in the lower pictures, could be abandoned and the area could be re-wetted and restored. So in this case study, the public participation followed the legal requirements, and there were also some additional information meetings. But what we could see was that only a minority of the residents and stakeholders actually attended these meetings and used them as information source. And most attendants were actually opposing the scheme. So there was little willingness to get actively and constructively involved in the discussions. And stakeholders who were actually for the scheme and supporting it, they did not really attend the meetings, or they lost interest throughout this long process. Instead, the main source of information for the local population was the local media. And this was found to be very problematic because the media picked up the negative opinions, and this fueled a polarization and caused a lot of protests. So in the end, there was a need for additional measures and changes, which then caused extra costs and also delayed the entire process. So what we can see from this example is that legally required participation encourages opponents to get involved, and also it took more than 14 years from the decision about the scheme to its actual implementation. And this is not unique for this case study, but was found to be a problem in many ICZM cases. So ICZM aims at an early and active involvement of stakeholders. And as you can see in the sketch, the stakeholder involvement would already take place in the project planning. And this was done in our second case study. This case is the integrated flood protection of Timmendorf. And also in this case study, a new flood protection measure was needed. But the local population was against hard structures like dikes and seawalls. And instead, they favored soft coastal protection measures, for example, beach nourishments or groin systems. But alone, these soft measures would not be sufficient to protect the settlement from flooding. So they decided to have stakeholder involvement already in the planning of the flood protection measure. So first, a systematic stakeholder mapping was done. And afterwards, they had several moderated stakeholder meetings. And in these meetings, which was attended by a maximum of 25 people, they first characterized the area based on different variables. For example, tourist infrastructure, security from flooding, or the landscape aesthetics. In the next step, they developed different coastal protection measure scenarios. So, for example, to have only protection against erosion, to have only protection against flooding, to have an integrated measure or no measure at all. And in the third step, a model-based sensitivity analysis was conducted. So here they assessed the effects of each of these measures on the variables. And as the result of this sensitivity analysis, the stakeholder group recommended that a combined coastal protection measure would be most suitable. And this was then suggested for the formal participation, for the formal planning procedure. And the group demanded to stay actively involved in the formal process. So here, a proactive involvement of stakeholders was done prior to the formal planning procedure, and the stakeholders were directly involved in the decision on a measure. And what we could see from this is that the involved stakeholders changed from being skeptics to actually being advocates of the measure. So based on these two examples, we can see that stakeholder involvement has its challenges and benefits. Benefits are that stakeholders can contribute a lot of local knowledge. It can help to generate a common understanding and to build trust and support. And it also enhances the acceptance and satisfaction of a decision. And this can later lead to better compliance. Challenges are that it's often time-consuming, labor-intensive, and also costly. And as we could see, only a limited number of stakeholders can usually participate. And it can be confrontational and lead to new problems or escalate existing ones in case there is already conflicts between different stakeholder groups. But in general, when we compare the time from the problem identification to the implementation of a solution, we can see that in unilateral decisions, the time from the identification of the problem to the decision is actually quite short and straightforward. But then the time from the decision to the implementation can be rather lengthy and affected by protests and public outcries, as it was the case in Markgrafenheide. With decisions with proactive stakeholder involvement, here the process from the problem identification to the decision often takes a longer time, but then the time to the implementation can often be shortened. So to conclude, a proactive stakeholder involvement can shorten the time from the issue identification to the implementation of a solution. And it also ensures that stakeholder groups are more balanced. And for this, stakeholder mapping is crucial. In the next part of this lecture, I will show you how stakeholders can be mapped. And for this, I will use the example of mussel cultivation in the Chechen Lagoon. Mussel cultivation can be used as a measure against eutrophication and thereby support the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. But it can also support socioeconomic development. For example, higher water transparencies can be beneficial for tourism development, and also mussel cultivation can provide new jobs or job alternatives, for example, for fishermen. And in our case study in the Chechen Lagoon, when we started the process, we first had to ask ourselves which stakeholders need to be involved and how. And for this, we conducted stakeholder mapping. So stakeholder mapping helps you to identify stakeholders and the required level of involvement. And in the first step, you identify and you list the stakeholders. And an easy and common way to do this is to first look at the human activities that are relevant for the area. So in our case, this was, for example, nature protection, fisheries, tourism, and administration. And then you list stakeholder groups for each of these activities. So just as an example, for nature protection, this could be environmental authorities from the federal down to the local level. It can be NGOs, but also environmental research. The next step is then the actual mapping of stakeholders. And you can do this according to their level of interest and influence. And in this slide, you see the matrix exemplarily for nature protection. So in this case, the stakeholders with a high level of interest and influence were the state and regional environmental authorities. Also, national environmental agencies have a high level of influence, but might have a lower interest in the local or regional level. Then you have stakeholders that have a high level of interest, but low level of influence. This could, for example, be NGOs, environmental research institutes. And finally, there are stakeholders who might have an interest, but a rather low one, and also a low level of influence. For example, bird watchers who might have an interest because mussel cultivation could attract new birds, but because they can easily switch to other sites, their interest and influence is very low. And you do this, of course, not only for one human activities, but for all of them. And hereby you try to be very precise and you actually name the concrete NGOs and authorities. And this matrix then helps you to identify the needed level of involvement for all of these stakeholder groups. So the ones with a high level of interest and high level of influence, these are your key stakeholders. So you need to make sure that they are actively involved in the process and you collaborate with these stakeholders. That means that you partner with them in the development of alternatives and also preferred solutions. The ones with a high level of influence but lower interest, you need to make sure that they are satisfied. So you involve them throughout the process. That means you work directly with these stakeholders throughout the process to ensure that issues and concerns are understood and considered. Then you have the ones with a high level of interest but low level of influence. And it is important to take their concerns into account because this is usually the group that can cause a lot of noise and protests if they are not considered. So they should be consulted. That means that you obtain feedback from the stakeholders on analysis, alternatives, and decisions. And finally, the stakeholders of least concern, the ones with a low level of influence and interest, here it would be sufficient to inform them from time to time. So that means that you provide balanced and objective information to assist them in understanding the problems, alternatives, and solutions. And you can see that these 4 levels of involvement range from a rather passive side to an active side. And while the legal requirements are more on the passive side of involvement, ICZM encourages an active involvement of stakeholders. What is also important to note is that the level of influence and interest of single stakeholders or groups can change over time. And this is illustrated in this figure. So the figure shows the 6 steps of the systems approach framework. And this comprises the typical ICZM cycle. So in our case study on mussel cultivation, our key stakeholder was the state agency for environment as the authority responsible for water and nature policy implementation. But also fishermen and local mayors had quite a high interest in the issue, so they were consulted in the beginning when we talked about the mussel cultivation in general. But throughout the process, it turned out that the most suitable option for mussel cultivation in the area would be a nearshore mussel farm to support nature protection. So in this case, the fishermen actually lost interest because they did not really see conflicts. They did not really see spatial conflicts, but also no possibility for future jobs or alternative jobs. In contrast, the local mayor gained interest and especially influence as soon as his particular municipality was chosen as a potential site. So it is important to note that the level of interest and influence can change, and therefore a re-evaluation of stakeholder maps is needed from time to time. Finally, I would like to show you that there are different methods that can be applied in the 4 levels of involvement. So to inform stakeholders, you can, for example, use fact sheets, websites, and media releases. Typical methods for consultation are public meetings or surveys. And to involve stakeholders, you can, for example, use workshops. And joint projects or partnerships are typically used to collaborate with stakeholders. But of course, each of these methods has its benefits and also limitations. Information sharing, like websites and fact sheets, they have the benefits that they can reach large numbers of stakeholders and the information can be targeted to the particular group. But the limitation is that this is often a one-directional communication and the information might not be accessible to everybody. Public meetings have the benefits that it allows communication with large groups, and it also provides the opportunity to raise issues and ask questions. But with public meetings facilitation is crucial. Also, workshops, they encourage joint working and problem solving, and they can help to build ownership of results, as we saw in the case of Timmendorf. But limitations are that they are time-consuming, often limited to a certain group size, and also here, facilitation is crucial. So what is important to note is that participation is nothing that happens automatically, but it actually requires careful preparation and also some level of experience. With this, I'd like to summarize the main points of my lecture. Legally required participation is conducted late in the process and encourages opponents to get involved. So this can lead to public polarization and protests, and also to delays in the implementation process. ICZM instead supports an active and early involvement of key stakeholders. And to ensure that stakeholder groups are balanced, stakeholder mapping is crucial. So stakeholder mapping helps you to identify stakeholders and the required level of involvement for different stakeholder groups. And because the level of influence and interest of different stakeholders can change, stakeholder maps need to be re-evaluated from time to time throughout the ICZM cycle. And with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention.